Seamus. I'm the managing partner of KPMG in Ireland, and thank you for joining us here today for our Fireside chat, looking back to move forward, analysing the impact of a year of changes that it's had on the business landscape here in Ireland and beyond. Make sure to join our conversation online on Twitter and Facebook, and be sure to use the hashtag Rebooting Ireland. I'm really delighted today to be joined by somebody who'll be no stranger to any of you, Danny McCoy, the CEO of Ibec. Danny, as you may know, hails originally from Galway and spent much of his early years working as an economist in places like the ESRI and the Central Bank, before a very eminent career as an academic, both in Ireland, in DCU and Trinity, and indeed in the UK, in Oxford and the University College of London. And before he became CEO of Ibec in 2009, where he leads over 200 people working across loads of different sectors, with big companies, small companies, domestic focused, international focused. So I think he's got a really interesting perspective from all the different members of Ibec, and indeed, Danny, from your own background. So I'm really delighted to be joined by you today. So thanks for joining us, Danny.
Thanks very much, Seamus.
So, Danny, I might kick off by asking you a question about that recovery, as the title of our Fireside today suggested. That we're in an environment that I think everybody would consider unusual and strange. And when we look back over the last 13 months, lots of businesses, members of Ibec and clients of ours have suffered in many ways, but also many of them have been remarkably successful and resilient. But if we look to the future, I'd be really interested in what you're hearing from your members as to what they think the future holds. There's lots of economic forecasters out there that are talking about a very strong recovery, both locally in Ireland and internationally, with a lot of pent-up demand and a lot of increased household savings. What are you hearing from people in different sectors, and what's your own perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Seamus. Well, look, as we know, we've gone through the 1 year mark, and I must say, even during the year, it's been variable. Some people are saying, well, we're not going, take the office, for instance, we're not going back till the new year. And they were the kind of leaders on it. And then other people followed as the information came. Then suddenly the ones who were saying we can stay away for the year suddenly are the ones that are rapidly wanting to go back. And so I think there's a lot of variable geometry out there, even from people who seem to have fixed positions at the start. In your introduction, you said I had an economics background, and I tend to look at this situation from that economics background right now. For me, the demand side hasn't changed. It's suppressed, and once it's released, I personally think in the vast majority of cases, the same demand will be there as we had going into this crisis. What may well be different, particularly given the length of time it's been on, is the supply side may be quite different. And by that I mean, what offices will be reopened? Will the employers provide what the employees think they might, which is the blended environment? These are the questions that are out at the moment for me, is that, just again, taking that employee basis, some people say they'd like to stay at home, some people want to come back to the office. That's a kind of demand for office. The supply side decision on that, I think, is still pretty much up in the air, particularly as we move on through time. Will we see the supply response being the same? We'll see this summer, hopefully. If we get the summer, even if it's an Indian summer, for tourism, there'll be plenty of demand, absolutely huge pent-up demand. But again, we all could be surprised by what supply is available. Lots of people may not come back into the market for what might be a precariously short season to go back into a winter of discontent, because what we do know, unfortunately, is that next winter will have some remnants of the pandemic, where the vaccination is not going to be the silver bullet. It's great at the moment when you're in the low teens, and it looks, in terms of vaccination, you kind of think, oh, everybody wants it. But I think as you're beginning to see in other societies now, you get to 50%, 60, 70 starts to get harder. And if you don't have everybody vaccinated, you probably will need to have some of those restrictive measures like social distancing or mask wearing, which again was going to encumber the supply side. So the truthful answer is, Seamus, I don't know, but what I fairly confident in is that the demand is going to exceed supply, and we're going to see an awful lot of inflation in all its forms. And one part of inflation is clearly by definition it's price growth, but actually a form of inflation is actually rationing. We're going to be rationed in lots of things, and lots of experiences are going to continue to be rationed. And I think that'll continue to be a source of frustration. I like everybody else thinks like, oh, if only this thing was over. But when you get to the bit that's over, it may actually be not what we were dreaming it to be. We could be in for quite a fair bit of dislocation into the winter. And I think businesses that are ready to adapt to that or even to service that probably will be the ones that will do well.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And just picking up on one aspect of that you touched on, that's kind of the whole debate about reopening. And I think it's interesting, and you and I and others would have had lots of discussions last summer around reopening when we got through the first and even second wave of the pandemic, and trying to figure out how to get the right balance between balancing the economic cost versus the obviously the personal cost of the pandemic. And that all changed with the third wave and the severity of it. And I think everybody, and certainly business, came to the realization that the best thing from an economic perspective at that point in time was to protect people. And that's certainly been the approach of government, and businesses has supported that, I think, since the start of the year. But at some point, that debate has to start again, and there has to be questions as to what the right time for reopening is, and how to reopen, and how to do so safely. And as you say, it's not that the virus is going to disappear; it's going to remain in some shape or form for a period of time. So have you had any thoughts as to what lessons we learned from last summer, maybe, and how businesses might need to start thinking about reopening now?
Yeah, so I guess the word appropriate really is in my mind at the moment, because as businesses, you have to take appropriate measures, you take appropriate risk, you allocate appropriately. So that word appropriately is very much DNA for business people. And I really find it extraordinary, the term abundance of caution. The abundance of caution basically means inappropriate caution. If it isn't appropriate caution, if there's an abundance of it, it's actually inappropriate. And I think that's what we're struggling with, is that businesses last summer and into the winter were trying to do the appropriate things, and then suddenly we get, as a society, get walloped by the new variant. It would appear, it's kind of nearly a different crisis, but pretty much like the same one. And I think that suddenly everybody went into their shell, and during that phase, this notion of abundance of caution seems to be catching hold. And I think that's a really difficult thing for business now, because we're going to have to challenge that abundance of taking our time, getting back slowly, because what we do know is that there's a real distinction between the business community, within the business community as well, that those who are open, be that like from the open in the sense of even working from home and being open, and that the activity still occurs, as opposed to those who are very firmly closed. And you see this even in something as a merit like antigen testing. It's those that are really closed off are really eager to put antigen testing into their businesses to get back, to get up and running again. But there's others who are actually open, might be too keen on the antigen testing because we're already open today, and that testing is costly potentially, and may give us the wrong results, might close us down. So you even within the business community, the all in it together part doesn't hold anymore. That would only be appropriate if this thing was what we thought it was at the start, a shock that was like 1 month, 6 weeks. But once we've gone to a year, I think it's not a great analogy, but when the bone is broken, it's setting in very very different ways, and we don't even have the business community, in my view, going to see the right across the mix of it, pulling in the one direction right now.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe if I could pivot the conversation a little bit into the international arena, and building on that theme about, like, there is a lot of optimism out there, and we would certainly see that in our client base as well. And that's not just in Ireland. We see it in other economies. There's clearly been a significant amount of stimuli into various economies, including in the US. And that's critical to Ireland, and has been critical to also for many years, but also to how well we have survived through the crisis in the last period of time. That environment is changing, and you've talked about this recently, including in a recent article in the Irish Times, where the corporate tax regimes, the environment for corporate tax regimes are changing. But also the whole environment for globalization has changed in recent times. What's your perspective on that, and the risks and indeed opportunities that I know you've for Ireland?
Yeah, so it's a really good point, because three really big things have happened actually during COVID, and whilst the society is transfixed on COVID, one thing was kind of half completed, but stirred up lots of other things. Brexit got completed over the turn of the year with some really significant consequences, which in itself will be a major and is a major issue for the business community, albeit we're distracted. The second one is really on the environmental issues and the scale of the ambition for the zero carbon economy and the targets for 2030 are really significant disruptors for business. And the third one that you've indicated and we've chat about is the changing of the guard in the United States. With the Biden administration coming in, I think there was such a dramatic movement away from the Trumpian era. I'm not sure people are parsing through Biden's approach right now. Multilateralism sounds good. It is good actually in of itself, but the speed at which you kind of move away from the unilateral view towards corporate taxation to suddenly being jumped to the US leading in reversing the trend for corporate tax rates to go upwards, as we know, headline rate 28%, minimum rate potentially at 21% in the States, as a kind of a lead into the OECD work on base erosion profit shifting. Similarly, we see the UK also on the argument that corporate should pay for the pandemic, justifying a kind of move since 1974. We see the first time the UK is raising corporate tax rates. These shifts, when you look at those three big things happening together, means that the environment for business is changing quite significantly. These, I think, are structural breaks. COVID, in my view, could be wrong, but COVID, in my view, actually won't show up hugely significantly in time as this kind of pivot moment that everybody talks about. I don't buy that. What I do buy, however, for the Irish business model is those things that I just described are huge. And the other bit about Biden, which I think is significant, if you think about our FDI model, is that yes, the corporate tax issue is coming under threat. I see an opportunity there as well, by the way, on the basis that once you've kind of arrived, it's a retention play for Ireland, not an aspiration one. And so if the corporate tax globally is relatively homogenous, then you can't be undercut by new aspirants. So at least, that's shutting the stable behind us. That's relatively good news, but we have to then compete on non-tax things like investment in our infrastructure, particularly our educational infrastructure, our housing, the societal sustainability issues. But in that regard, the other bit from the Biden move is this swing towards collectivism. And of course, collectivism has been out there, particularly in the labor market through the social media, where people can go under different movements, be they hashtag or whatever. We've also seen that in terms of the gig economy and workers' rights through Uber, Deliveroo, but now increasingly in technology companies, particularly stateside. But now it's actually been sanctioned by the president. And we see that in his choice of labor secretary as well, in Marty Walsh, former mayor of Boston. They'd be both very strong on saying collective bargaining rights at the level of the workplace, and up to and including trade union recognition, is kind of getting an imprimatur from the White House. Whether it goes all the way up to Capitol Hill, we'll see. But the other issue is that the global CEOs have also entered this debate by shifting the prism from shareholder value to stakeholder value. And when you do that, you don't get to choose your stakeholders. You know, you might say, well, I don't want to talk to the customer or the supplier, but the employees will just do as we've been doing before, the direct engagement model. Well, once you open up the conversation, it's going to be hard to actually put that genie back into the bottle. And so we're going to see what would be a dystopia to 2005 Ireland and the FDI model. Corporation tax under challenge and a direct engagement model under challenge. These would look like really bad conditions for our FDI model. And so I think that's the big challenge for the next couple of years, is that if we don't proactively engage in this, there will be big challenges, but there probably is, if we collectively put our heads together, a way to make lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, listen, in any of these challenges, there does come opportunity, as you say, because you know the corporate tax regime in Ireland has never been the most competitive in the world by any means. It's only ever been part of a package, and one that you're absolutely right that in recent years has become less relevant as other factors have become more important for FDI, both investing here and remaining here, as you say. One of those areas I feel is education, and our education system is one that, going back to the original focus in the 50s, 60s, 70s on FDI, our education system was a significant factor. It remains so today, but one which arguably we need to continue to innovate and invest in. What's your perspective on that, and are we doing enough and investing enough in our education system?
Yeah, I guess we, as a rich society, should be investing a lot more into not just the educational, but also the training element, for lifelong learning, for disruptive technologies and so on. And just as an aside, where I get the government's view of the Erasmus program, right? And this is not about the individuals involved, but we've used the Erasmus program now twice in the last 6 months. Once to demonstrate to Northern Ireland that the Republic would pay for Northern Erasmus aspirant students, which is great. What about the young apprenticeships in the more traditional, what about their opportunities? And then we see the offer in the last couple of days about the government for quarantine to pay the Erasmus students. Clearly, there are other skill sets of other young people who are abroad with the same kind of constraint. So that belies, I suppose, that not belies, but actually demonstrates that we're still very much think about education separate to the training aspects. And I think that's something that enlightened societies actually tend to crack that as they get wealthy. I think the overemphasis just on education in Ireland wasn't really intrinsic for itself. It was a way to change social class, to go from agrarian into professionals or whatever it might be. So we've got to mature up on that, and that's going to require that we devote much more resources. Because one of the signaling events, which I think is really important, is the rankings of universities. And of course, it's a bit like winning an Oscar. It doesn't matter when you have one. When you don't have one, it's very significant. And I think people are a bit too blasé on that perception in some of those ranking things. We need to be highly ranked on those things, other taxation, particularly now for the next couple of years, to demonstrate that the Irish business model has actually got more substance than a lot of people internationally be willing to concede.
Yeah, and maybe just picking up one other point on that that stakeholder capitalism agenda you mentioned there, because clearly, as you say, you can't choose your stakeholders, but one area where it's clearly getting and continues to get a lot of focus is in the environment and climate change area. It's a topic in pretty much every boardroom, and I'm sure all of your members are thinking about it in their own businesses. What are you seeing in terms of actions as a result of that, whether it be in terms of their business model or reporting or other aspects?
Yeah, so look, I think that ESG agenda, the environmental society governance agenda, it's not clear to me that when you package the three of them together, they actually are consistent, and that you might need to decouple and the focus. So on the environmental piece before and the sustainability, I think there's a lot of ignorance out there. There's a lot of unknown unknowns actually. People are picking up on there's something, that we need to salute the flag, but actually are pretty unsure as to what this is all about. And so I think there's a fair bit of complexity. You said at the start that my academic career, I actually lectured environmental economics. So a little knowledge is a day. But when I see some of the expressions of piety that can come from corporates, you're going, a bit like my point about the stakeholders. Once you enter into that fray, you can't get back out of it actually without huge brand damage. And I don't think a lot of companies and a lot of boards actually have sufficient understanding of the issues, which makes it pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
I know how ignorant I am of cybersecurity, and I tend to try to get there because I know the consequences. That's much more tangible to us. The environmental pieces and commitments could be a lot more damaging to corporations if they enter into it without knowing the full details.
Yeah, great. Okay, listen, Danny, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today, and this conversation we could probably easily continue on for a very long time, but if I can just ask you one final question for now. In a post-pandemic world, whenever that might be, what is Danny McCoy most looking forward to doing?
I'm looking forward, Seamus, to a Galway-Donegal All-Ireland final, and you buy me a drink, whatever the result is.
Very good. Thank you, Danny.